Does it work?
I hope so.
Okay. As you know, I'm not the panelist here, and I'm not a security expert either. I was asked to bring my value added, if any, on from an aerospace and defense industry perspective. And I was very happy to hear all those comments before, because it facilitates a lot of what I wanted to say. So the first thing I should say is that it's obvious that security issue consists of many layers, not just one layer. It has to create what perhaps you mentioned, Rob, properly. It's a whole complex of defense, industry, and so on, and military. The second thing is, I'm not so sure, of course it is, for some countries like Israel, it's a national thing, or it starts from domestic. But for us in Greece, we don't really have a domestic issue security. We have a more an external security issue, which is not just the long time issue with Turkey, for instance, but it's more of the fact that Greece is in a location where there has been a lot of movement from people, especially, coming from the Middle East towards Europe. So that was really our biggest issue. The issue is, and keeping in mind what you have mentioned about doing more with less, for us in Greece it's a very important thing that there is a multilateral cooperation. And I will mention a very specific example that has occurred the last 2 or 3 years here in Greece and in the area. But before I say that, I have to say that, in my opinion, the thing that puts a cement in the multinational security cooperation is the industry, really. Much more than people realize. It's not just a question of states talking to each other, but you really need something else to continue this dialogue, and this is the industry. This is the creation of an ecosystem of security. First of all, when you have an industrial cooperation in those areas that I mentioned, security, aerospace, and defense, you add another dimension of the private sector, and you add, in a way, additional sensors that help and facilitate, first of all, closing any gaps in security, and secondly, the cooperation between two nations. Secondly, there is a continuous give and take. It's a commercial, so there is continuous attention. And most importantly, and I won't take too much of your time, is that in this, when you have industrial cooperation in aerospace and defense and security, the people that are involved in this, they're also in the neighborhood of people who make decisions on security and national defense. So it's very important that this thing exists. I'm talking about, again, the industrial cooperation. And to give a very specific example, so I don't get too theoretical here, since we talk about Greece and the area, the last 3 years we have seen an unbelievable cooperation between Greece and foremost with Israel, for which we're very happy to have this, but also at the same time a very big cooperation between Greece, Egypt, and some more moderate Arab states like UAE. Maybe some of you do not know this, but this thing has been accelerated, not because of national strategies, but also because of industrial cooperation. For instance, last year there has been some technology transfer from Greece to Egypt in the area of defense, and this has strengthened a lot the ties. Greece has become a very important supplier in the same area to the United Arab Emirates. And lastly, regarding Israel, and that's very important, Israel, which does not really need that much Greek know-how, but it needs Greece as a base to enter the European markets and NATO by taking, for instance, a NATO and EU certification. So last year also we had 3 deals like that happening between Israel and Greece. And that really explains why we have been quite successful. As you know, there's a lot of cooperation between Egypt, Israel, Greece and the UAE right now, was also mentioned by Admiral Apostolakis yesterday very suitably. So again, I think it's very important that we add in the security dimension the influence and the support and the addition of a cement, if I'm allowed to use the word, of industrial cooperation between countries in this area. It's very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's proceed quickly to the Q&A. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Could you please identify yourself?
Yeah, Klaus. My name is Klaus. My name is Klaus Sorensen. I used to be the head of the European Commission's crisis management outfit. And we have been talking a lot about cyber here, and obviously it's on everybody's mind. I just wondered if anybody in the panel could comment on the international status of cyber attacks. I mean, is it warfare? Is it covered by our international rule book? People have been saying that, in fact, if you harm the infrastructure of another state, as we have seen with Stuxnet and as we have seen also with WannaCry, we have had countries of the European Union that have been severely economically affected, then you could actually resort to self-defense. But I think it's an area of evolution. I was just wondering if any of you had any ideas on how it relates to the UN Charter and Article 51.
Rob?
Well, I think it's that's a very excellent question, by the way, and it's in the minds of many, not just in the UN system and the EU, but of course NATO as well. And as we were hearing from our other panelists, cyber has become effectively a new means by which to wage the interests of interstate conflict, of course. So it more or less, I think, meets the criteria that you were laying out. What we haven't done yet, I think, is to define the nature of our response yet. And like so many things that are reflective of the cybersecurity reality today, we are struggling to cope with its modern effects. We don't have an international governance framework to deal with it. We have effectively an I thought that was editorial control. I was talking rubbish. He was taking away my microphone. I would have respect for that, actually. Just to end that point, we don't have a governance framework, so we haven't worked out how to deal with that, and we're still struggling to deal with the effects of it. And we have a very much fragmented, of course, political system in the world about these issues. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a very important issue. We haven't solved it yet.
Yes, allow me just to add briefly that I don't know any single state which not at the same time the offender and the victim. Second, there is no international framework so far. And third, we were never so close to an incidental, accidental break of a large conflict, because no one will be able to detect in real time if that was an error. Thank you.
I think that the status of our knowledge about this new evolving field is the following. The people who are supposed to know best and most about the effects of that, let's say those Americans who largely fund the major programs that deal both with defense and offense, and therefore are at the cutting edge of both the technologies and what can be done on a state level, and have given much thought to this matter. When you talk to them, you realize that they feel clueless themselves. That is to say, they can think a bit on the short term, but once you look into the fourth, fifth, sixth generation effects of everything, it becomes so blurred that they must confess complete ignorance. And the ignorance is on many, many attributes. The first is that one doesn't know where technology will take us. This is very much a thing that is evolving very fast and in some surprising ways. Then it presents some new issues that we never confronted. Those who deal with strategy, for example, have been habituated during the Cold War to fall back on this, to my mind, very elusive concept, but central concept of deterrence. How do you avoid large-scale destruction on yourself? You deter the other guy who possesses that ability from doing that. But when applied to cyber, deterrence becomes so much more difficult. But there are some promises there. Defense may offer better options than it had with nuclear. So it's not all negative. There may be some positives, but no one really knows what they are. And this is what is the most frightening of all. I remember in my older days, we had the same feeling about another type of large-scale destructive thing, which was biological warfare. Now, the world's experience with biological warfare is very limited, and luckily, not many people have thought about what this would really entail, should it ever come to pass. But everybody did have this sort of instinctive revulsion from the very concept of biological weapons to the point of avoiding tackling what it really means and how to handle that seriously. Now, I wouldn't say that cyber involves revulsion, but it does involve a sense of awe. This is a whole new big thing that may define the 21st century in ways that are still unknown, and we have no clue at what is our current state of affairs.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. A microphone to the... Sorry? Oh, okay. Make it quick, please, because we're running completely out of time.
Okay, Chris Cook, the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at UCL, which has got some interest in cyber, but my interest is in resilience. I was at a GCSP forum 12 years ago on the subject of economic terrorism, and basically thinking, what can actors do to actually collapse the system? And I recall saying that the only difference between an economic terrorist and a hedge fund is motive. Okay, because one will do it deliberately and the other will do it by accident. And I was pointing out then, too big to fail, which actually then followed 2 years later. So the point of my question is, how exposed do you gentlemen think markets are? I believe they're massively exposed to adverse action, whether it's, you say, HFT or whatever. You almost can. I mean, I'd like your view actually, because I think the risk of discontinuities in markets has grown as things have become more and more centralized. I'm not talking about the banks, I'm talking about the exchanges. They were a problem 12 years ago, and in my view, they're a bigger problem now and not widely understood. So I'll just chuck this bomb into the discussion.
Whoever. Well, if I may answer, it's a structural thing, and it's not easy to answer it in just a few seconds. But I think, if I recall saying about blurring the lines, there is also economic competition, economic and trade war that is prevalent today. And so I think markets are quite exposed to systemic changes that are occurring in the international system today. So I don't know if it answers your question, but I don't have, maybe we can later discuss it a little bit more. Okay, that's the end of the session. Thank you all very much.